While everyone was watching the trade war play out in public, the tweets, the tariffs, the threats, something far bigger was being assembled in private. A coalition of nations quietly rewriting the rules of global commerce. And the man leading it? You've probably never thought of him as a revolutionary. Mark Carney is not the kind of man who makes noise. He doesn't do dramatic press conferences. He doesn't trade insults on social media. He doesn't show up to summits looking for a fight. For most of his career, he operated in the background of global finance. The kind of background where decisions get made that ordinary people only feel years later, in their mortgage rates, their grocery bills, their retirement savings. He ran the Bank of Canada, then the Bank of England, two of the most consequential central banking roles on the planet. And in both cases, he managed to do something remarkably rare in modern public life. He was effective without being loud. So when Carney became Canada's Prime Minister and started making moves on the global trade stage, a lot of people assumed it would be more of the same. Steady, careful, incremental. They were wrong. Because right now, in meeting rooms in Ottawa, Brussels, Singapore, and Tokyo, Carney is helping to assemble something that trade experts are calling genuinely historic. A potential economic bridge connecting two of the world's most powerful trading blocs. A framework that could link 1.5 billion people under a set of common trade rules designed specifically to make the global economy more resilient against unilateral pressure from any single nation, including the most powerful nation on Earth. This is the story of how that alliance came together, why it matters, and what it could mean for the future of global commerce. To understand why this is happening, you have to go back to what triggered it. Tariffs. Specifically, a sweeping set of tariffs announced by the Trump administration in what was publicly branded as Liberation Day. A package of new trade barriers targeting dozens of countries simultaneously, framed not as a temporary measure but as a long-term restructuring of how America engages with the global economy. Trump's position on tariffs has never been subtle. He's held it for decades, and he's expressed it in plain terms. Tariffs have made our country rich, strong, powerful, and safe. They have been successfully used by other countries against us for decades. When it comes to tariffs, we have all the cards. Now, you can debate the economics of that claim. Plenty of experts do. But what you cannot debate is the impact. When the world's largest economy starts treating tariffs as a permanent strategic instrument rather than an occasional negotiating lever, every other major economy in the world has to make a choice. Do you fight back directly? Do you try to negotiate exceptions? Do you wait and hope the pressure eases? Or do you build something new? A small but significant group of governments, led quietly by Canada, chose the fourth option. While the tariff headlines were dominating the news cycle, something else was happening that most people didn't pay much attention to. The Trump administration was also trying to build its own coalitions. The most prominent example was something called the Board of Peace, a body proposed to oversee the reconstruction of Gaza. 60 countries were invited to participate. The United States would chair it with veto power. Each member would contribute $1 billion. Some countries said yes. Israel, Argentina, Russia, Hungary, and Saudi Arabia were among those willing to join. But a striking number of America's closest traditional allies said no. France declined, Germany declined, the United Kingdom declined. So did Italy, Greece, Norway, Sweden, New Zealand, Slovenia, and Ukraine. Their stated reasons varied. Legal concerns, conflicts with UN frameworks, discomfort about Russia's inclusion. But the underlying message was hard to miss. A meaningful bloc of American allies was signaling that this version of American-led multilateralism wasn't one they could support. And then something even more pointed happened. Canada, a country that shares the world's longest undefended border with the United States, a country that sends roughly 75% of its exports to America, had its own invitation to the Board of Peace revoked, right in the middle of its trade dispute with Washington. Think about what that moment meant. A neighbor, an ally, a country deeply woven into the American economic fabric, disinvited from an American diplomatic table. If Carney needed a signal that the old playbook for managing the U.S. relationship was no longer working, that was it. Here is where the story gets interesting. Really interesting. At Davos, the annual gathering in Switzerland where global leaders talk about the state of the world, Carney was unusually direct about what he was trying to build. He described efforts to create a bridge between the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the European Union. The CPTPP includes Japan, Australia, Vietnam, Singapore, Malaysia, Mexico, Chile, New Zealand, and others. The EU covers 27 European nations. Together, a connected zone would encompass roughly 1.5 billion people and close to a third of total global economic output. But the real genius of this proposal isn't the size. Size alone doesn't change anything if you're still operating under disconnected, overlapping, bureaucratically complicated trade rules. The real breakthrough, the thing that turns this from a political gesture into an actual structural transformation, is hidden inside a piece of trade policy called rules of origin. Here's the simple version. When a product crosses a border, someone has to decide where it came from. That matters because tariff rates depend on a product's national origin. A car assembled in Japan faces different duties than one assembled in Mexico. Fine. That logic makes sense for simple products, but modern products aren't simple. A single smartphone contains components designed in California, manufactured in Taiwan, assembled in China or Vietnam, quality tested in South Korea, and shipped through Singapore. A commercial aircraft has parts from dozens of countries. A pharmaceutical might be developed in Germany, produced using ingredients from India, packaged in Ireland. The global supply chain is genuinely global, but the trade rules that govern it still treat goods as if they belong to one nationality. So companies end up paying tariffs multiple times on the same product as it passes through different trade zones. That's inefficient, and it forces businesses to make decisions based on avoiding bureaucratic friction rather than genuine economic logic. Now here's what the proposed EU CPTPP framework would change. Both blocs already have separate trade agreements with many of the same countries. The EU has deals with Japan, Canada, New Zealand, and the UK. The CPTPP already links most of the Pacific economies, but these agreements operate in parallel, like two train networks that never connect. What accumulation, the technical mechanism at the heart of this proposal, would do is allow a product assembled across multiple CPTPP and EU member countries to be treated as if it were made entirely within one unified economic zone. A component from a factory in Vietnam, further processed in Germany, assembled in Canada, sold in France, under this framework, it would flow through that entire journey without triggering separate tariff calculations at every stop. The commercial implications are enormous. Companies would have a powerful new incentive to deepen their manufacturing integration across this combined zone. Supply chains that currently face friction at every border would suddenly become dramatically more efficient. And perhaps most importantly, any tariff pressure applied at one point of entry could naturally redirect activity through alternative routes within the network. Not a trade war, a trade bypass. This is the question that separates real analysis from speculation. So let's look at what's actually happening on the ground. Earlier this year, Canada sent one of its most senior diplomatic officials, John Hannaford, specifically to Singapore, to take the temperature among Indo-Pacific leaders about this arrangement. Singapore is not a random choice. It sits at the crossroads of Southeast Asian trade. It's a founding CPTPP member, and it has one of the sharpest trade policy communities in the world. Getting a read from Singapore means getting a read from a government that takes these things seriously. The response, according to a Canadian government official, was genuinely positive. We've had very fruitful discussions on this with partners around the world. The work is definitely coming along. That's careful diplomatic language. But in the context of trade negotiations, coming along is actually meaningful progress. The conceptual foundation for this initiative was laid back in November, when both blocs began talking about how to respond to the fragmentation of global free trade. A Japanese trade official described the motivation with notable candor. "We see a lot of value in increasing trade among EU and CPTPP parties, which would also contribute to enhancing supply chain resilience." That same official also cautioned that a concrete outcome may not be expected in the short term, which is honest, and which actually suggests this is a serious process rather than a political announcement designed to generate headlines and then quietly disappear. One European diplomat put the mood more vividly. "If the EU is up for the conversation, then of course it would make things very interesting indeed. On the business side, the pressure is coming from the private sector as well. And that matters, because trade agreements rarely succeed without commercial constituencies pushing for them." The German Chamber of Commerce and Industry has been vocal in its support. Germany's export-dependent economy, built around high-value manufacturing that depends on complex global supply chains, is acutely exposed to trade disruption, and German businesses understand the value of a more integrated framework. The British Chambers of Commerce have also expressed support. Notable because the UK, post-Brexit, is both a CPTPP member and actively rebuilding its global trade relationships. The alignment between British commercial interests and this broader initiative is more than coincidental. Clemens Kober, Director of Trade Policy at the German Chamber, explained the practical appeal directly. "Having the possibility of accumulating origin between different free trade agreements is very useful." And looking further ahead, he sees the potential for a multiplier effect. If you can see tangible benefits in different areas, that could also entice other countries to join in and team up in a positive sense. The more the merrier. Canada's Trade Minister Maninder Sidhu was even more explicit about the political intent when he publicly backed this initiative. "This is exactly why Canada is leaning into deeper partnerships across the Indo-Pacific and Europe. Stronger ties between the EU and CPTPP members will strengthen supply chains, unlock new opportunities for Canadian businesses, and reinforce a rules-based trading system." Canada is proud to be at the center of this momentum. Now let's just step back from the technical details for a moment. What's really happening here goes way beyond trade policy. This is actually a story about how medium-sized democracies, countries that don't have the raw economic scale to confront great powers directly, are rethinking what leverage actually looks like in the modern world. Carney framed it in terms of middle powers. Countries like Canada, Japan, Australia, the Netherlands, South Korea, New Zealand. On their own, they can be pressured, but collectively, they represent something considerably harder to coerce. Combined, they're home to sophisticated manufacturing, advanced technology sectors, vast agricultural networks, and, well, hundreds of millions of middle-class consumers. The strategy here isn't confrontation. It isn't retaliation. It's not even really defiance in the traditional sense. It's structural. The idea is to build a system so interconnected, so mutually beneficial, and so technically resilient that any pressure applied at one point simply redistributes economic activity through the network, rather than stopping it altogether. It's kind of like water flowing around a rock. The water doesn't fight the rock. It just finds a different path. And here's what makes this genuinely novel. It's being built without an explicit adversary. Canada, Japan, Australia, and the EU aren't forming a bloc to go to economic war with America. They still trade extensively with the United States. They still have security alliances, intelligence partnerships, and deep cultural ties with Washington. What they're building is something more subtle, an alternative architecture that gives them options they currently don't have. Options that reduce vulnerability. Options that create new commercial paths. Options that strengthen their hand in any future negotiation with any partner under any set of circumstances. This wouldn't be a complete picture without acknowledging the real challenges. Trade agreements are hard. They take years. They require sustained political will across multiple governments, each with their own domestic pressures. The CPTPP and the EU aren't unified actors with single decision-makers. They're coalitions of countries with divergent interests that have to be carefully balanced. Inside Europe alone, there are real tensions. Some governments want to move quickly on the accumulation framework. Others want to focus first on practical resilience building before formalizing anything legally binding. And some are just cautious about anything that could further complicate their relationship with Washington. There's also the question of the American reaction. The United States isn't going to be indifferent to the construction of a significant trade alliance that is, at least in part, designed to reduce exposure to American economic pressure. How Washington responds, whether through negotiation, additional tariffs, or efforts to fracture the emerging coalition, is genuinely unpredictable. And there's always the challenge of momentum. Political urgency has a short shelf life. What feels like an existential priority today can quietly slide down the agenda when elections intervene, economies shift, or new crises demand attention. The Japanese officials' caution, a concrete outcome may not be expected in the short term, isn't pessimism. It's just a sober acknowledgement of how these processes actually work. And yet, something real is being built here. Something that honestly wouldn't have seemed plausible even 2 years ago, before the tariffs, before the fracturing of old alliances, before a series of diplomatic flashpoints forced governments to confront the question of what they'd do if the frameworks they'd depended on for decades were no longer reliable. The history of international trade is full of initiatives that looked impossibly ambitious at their start and ended up reshaping the world. The original GATT, NAFTA, the European Single Market, the CPTPP itself, rebuilt from scratch after the United States walked away. None of them were quick, none of them were clean. All of them, once completed, turned out to be more consequential than anyone originally predicted. What Carney is leading, quietly, technically, methodically, is still in its early stages. It may not fully succeed. The complexity may prove just too great. The political will may falter. But here's the thought that stays with you when you step back from all the details and look at the larger arc of this story. The most powerful response to a trade war may not be a louder trade war. It might actually be a new map, drawn carefully by steady hands in rooms that don't make the news. And by the time the world notices it exists, it may already be the world they're living in. If this story made you see the global economy a little differently, if it helped you connect dots between a trade deal in Singapore, a tariff in Washington, and a factory floor in Germany, then that's really why we do this. This kind of journalism takes time, research, and a genuine commitment to going beyond the headline. If you found that valuable, a like and a comment genuinely make a difference to how this content reaches people. Every signal tells the algorithm that depth matters, that context matters, that people want more than just reaction videos and hot takes. And if you want to go further, hit join. Your support keeps this independent. We'll keep following this story, because it is far from over. Thanks for watching. Stay curious.